Good afternoon, everybody. It is a little bit after 4 o'clock, and I think we should probably start so that we can stick to our schedule. I see people are still trickling in person. I just got a text message from somebody saying we just joined on Zoom, so I know there's also people on Zoom, so the crowd is larger than what we see here and might still get even bigger. So good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us here for the 2024 Linguistics Martin Luther King Colloquium. Thank you for everybody who tracked through the snow to be here in person, and also I know people are on Zoom online. It is really for me a privilege and a pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, Professor Quentin Williams. This one is personal for me in a way that very few, if any, of the colloquium presentations I've attended at Michigan in 20 years have been. I grew up in South Africa. I've lived in the US now for 25 years, but I have kept close ties with South Africa for both personal and professional reasons. Usually my professional connections in South Africa are rather divorced from my professional life in the US. And it's only on very rare occasions, such as today, that a visitor makes it possible for me to combine these two things. So it's for me personally just really a wonderful opportunity, Quentin, to have you here. So Professor Williams is somebody whose work I have known for many years and I've always really admired. He's transforming the field of linguistics in South Africa, and through his many publications and talks, also outside of South Africa globally. He's, I think, setting for us an example of a way in which linguistics can be done such that we are doing both good linguistics research, but also research that engages publicly. And I think, in a sense, the also in that statement should probably be removed, because I think Quentin's work shows us that it is not an addition to good linguistics research, but showing how that social engagement, language activism, and research feed on each other and support each other, and they are good because they go together. So a little bit more about Professor Williams. He completed his education from undergrad to the PhD at the University of Western Cape, where he earned his PhD in 2012. And he's had then a faculty appointment there since. So he's been his whole career at University of Western Cape. In addition to his affiliation in linguistics at Western Cape, and he's been really pivotal in helping linguistics as a field thrive at the University of Western Cape and also grow. But in addition to his affiliation with the linguistics department there, he's also director of the Center for Multilingualism and Diversity Research at the university. And if you haven't yet had a chance to visit the website of the center, I would encourage you to do so. The work that's happening in that center is really interesting, and I think very relevant to the work that many of us in the linguistics department here do or are interested in. Really kind of in very interesting ways make the argument for the very tight connection between linguistic diversity and diversity in general. And where linguistic diversity is both diversity of languages, but also of varieties of languages. So a very good example of how you can't, of work showing how you can't have a really representative, diverse community if that's not also linguistically and language form, language type diverse. Professor Williams is the author, is a prolific author, and he has published extensively on topics related to especially things like multilingualism, language and identity, language and society, and usually and often in a kind of post-colonial context. The list of his publications and his editorships of edited volumes and special issues of journal and so on is too long to go through all of them, but I think I'm going to read the titles of 3 of his recent publications, and it will give you an idea for the kind of work he's doing and also what we will learn of more today. So one recent title is Seeking Linguistic Justice, Multilingual Activism and Linguistic Citizenship in Post-National South Africa. So we see that connection between language and society, language and and basic human rights. Another title, Becoming a Public Sociolinguist, and that's a core part of his identity. He's also a public academic and a public figure besides just an academic, and really combining the two also in his research. Last example, Linguistic Citizenship as Decoloniality, teaching hip-hop at an historically black university. So there again we see the themes of citizenship and how that's connected to language and linguistic. And I think this is citizenship not just in terms of which country you're a citizen of, but how you participate in society and community. And this list can go on, right? It's an extensive list of publications in many prominent places. In addition to a list of publications, Professor Williams is also a sought-after presenter in South Africa and in the world. In fact, yesterday he gave a talk at NYU, although on Zoom, so we get him in person, but NYU got him in Zoom, although he was in the US. He's also a public scholar, right? And he engages not just with the academic audiences, but with the media, with government, with policymakers, with communities directly. So really kind of living that scholar activist, scholar public engagement identity. Quentin, thank you so much that you have made your way from beautiful, warm summer in the Western Cape province of South Africa to one of the coldest spells we've had in many, many years in Michigan. I hope that your visit here is as positive for you as it is for us to have you here. And I hope that this is not the end of our engagement with you. So, Quentin, over to you. You see the title of Quentin's presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andres. Okay. Thank you very much. I do appreciate the invitation to speak to you here today. A very kind invitation from the Linguistics Department to talk about Kaaps. I thought of the title of the talk and what to share with you, and immediately it struck me that I need to tell the story of Kaaps, not only of what's happening with it today, but how it was formed since colonialism in South Africa. So I'm going to try to navigate this in a way that I can sort of change the slides and also read my presentation to you if you indulge me. So I'd like to sort of present or to start this talk by first digging into clarifying some of the ideas and the notions that I will use. What do I mean by liberate? And why is this language being called a language? So in this talk this evening, as I have outlined in my abstract, I present to you the story of the liberation of Kaaps in post-apartheid South Africa. Now, but liberation means a process of empowerment, putting in place linguistic infrastructures so that the speakers who are able to enjoy their language on a daily basis can see and hear, but also read and understand their language. And as I go through the presentation, you'll see that there are a lot of steps or acts of liberations that we've taken over the last few years to liberate or to move towards liberation of Kaaps. Why language in quotation marks? There has been a debate about this, and I'll get into that particular debate, but it has to do with conscientizing the speaker of Kaaps in knowing that their language is a language. So I want to sort of take you through the story of Kaaps from the beginning, from 1652, and lead you through how it became associated with particular communities, how it went from a slave lingua franca to becoming a language associated with a particular religious group, but then also becoming a language of gossip and a language of protest during apartheid. And then I want to end with some of the projects that we are currently engaged in that we see are empowerment projects in fully liberating or the Kaaps speaker. In the final part of the talk, I want to just sort of reflect on some of the pitfalls of liberation, and that sometimes it goes well, other times it does not, and I sort of want to just reflect on that a little bit. So this is the.
That was my responsibility.
That's it. Okay.
To go through the house rules, and I skipped another part of the presentation. But yeah, house rules is, if you're on Zoom, there is a transcription available. I'd forgotten to say that, I apologize. And when we get to the Q&A, also, if you're on Zoom, you can use the Q&A question there. And Quentin, the next slide is the land acknowledgement that I completely badly skipped. I just saw your title slide and remembered that.
Yeah.
I will not interrupt you any further. The land
No problem.
I'm sorry, people, I should have given.
Okay, no worries. So this is the sort of the contents page of the presentation, and so why focus on Kaaps? Talk a little bit about the history of Kaaps, and then the future of Kaaps, and this idea of whether a dictionary or standardizing Kaaps, or even developing Kaaps English bilingual learning materials are actually going to liberate Kaaps speakers in South Africa. Are we doing the right thing? Most activists, most linguists in South Africa have asked us that question. But throughout, these are also considered as acts of liberation by myself and the activists that I work with. So what's the first act of liberation? For us, since we've introduced into the public debate that a greater focus should be on Kaaps and how to develop Kaaps further within post-apartheid South Africa, we wanted to change the debate on how you talk about Kaaps, not necessarily as a variety of, sorry, I just need to go to the next slide. Do I go like that? Oh, okay. Well, all right, somebody will do it for me. Not necessarily as not necessarily a variety of Afrikaans, but as a language. And what do we mean by Kaaps being a language? Why a language? Well, we argue that it can be seen simply as a system of signs governed by rules and used by a community of speakers. That's very Sausorian, if you can recognize it. But others have also defined Kaaps as a language through the decades, through the ages. Myself excluded, there has been folks like Gerard van Heijsteen at Northwest University, Adam Small, the dramatist and poet, Peter Snyders, the poet, Hein Willemse, the poet as well, and so on and so forth. We sort of recognize that in defining Kaaps as a language, not only amongst ourselves as linguists, but also in the public, the speakers have come to the understanding that indeed, if we understand Kaaps as a language, then we can also talk about how to raise the functions of Kaaps in controlling domains. And we've looked at this very carefully. Of course, Kaaps has been written down. There are dramas, poetries, and novels. The speakers read it in newspaper columns, in newspapers and magazines. Parts of the Bible have been translated, including the Psalms. A dictionary is on its way, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. But there have been calls also to develop a spell checker, that a Wikipedia page should be developed, and that the grammar and orthography requires further development. This debate is an ongoing debate, and it has created camps, not only amongst the linguists, but also amongst activists. But for us, we saw this as a first act of liberation, moving towards liberation, so that we can have a better debate about Kaaps in terms of defining it as a language, but also opening up the science of Kaaps, the linguistic science. Now, when we explored Kaaps and we talked about the origins of Kaaps, we said that Kaaps is distinct from Afrikaans because in the archive, there are many references, examples of early use of Kaaps. And so we moved into a second act of liberation where we developed an archival research project to unearth, excavate early voices of Kaaps from the slave period right up until just before apartheid. Linguists in South Africa did not give us the answer, but historians did. And when we read historians, we discovered that the description of Kaaps was that of a slave lingua franca. Now, when Jan van Riebeeck left, and this is a picture of him meeting the Khoi, so he's on your left, and he's meeting here the Gorong Haikona tribe that was occupying the beach area at the Cape. And this is the sort of the start, if you can think about it, the image of colonialism. But Jan van Riebeeck, who represented, or who was a commander who built a fort at the Cape, he was part of the Dutch East Indian Company. He stayed there for a while. If you read his diaries, you know, he's pretty much very miserable, didn't like the place much. But when he left the Cape of Good Hope as commander, he wrote to his successor, Zacharias Wagenaar, in 1662 that, and this is from his diary, that the slaves here learned nothing but Dutch, and so too the Hottentots, the Hottentots or the Khoi, so that no other language is spoken here. That was obviously a lie, because since the colonialization of the Cape, there had been great mixture of interactions between the Dutch, Khoi at the sea and inland, and the slaves brought to the Cape. Creolization was bound to occur, and indeed the early roots of Kaaps, were beginning to form. The historian Robert Sell, for example, states that contact between the slaves and the many languages that they brought to the Cape, and indeed interactions with the Khoi and the VOC, or the Dutch East India Company, produced what he calls this slave lingua franca, and it was understood across the colony. Indeed, as far as historical linguistics studies teach us, although many of these studies only map Kaaps from the 1800s, Kaaps can be defined as such. It is a lingua franca of the enslaved, indentured workers, and the indigenous Khoi, or the plural of Khoi, but it was also used by the Dutch East Indian Company administrators, soldiers, and free burghers. And as far as we can surmise from these few studies, and based on some of the data points that they present, it crystallized into a pidgin. There were initial contact between the Khoi Portuguese and Dutch. It creolized from the 1600s to the 1700s and can be understood as a locally inflected form of Cape Dutch. And as far as we know further, it's a mixture of Malay, Low Portuguese, Java, and Khoi languages, and including languages slaves brought from across Bali, Ceylon, Colombia, Batavia, Indonesia, India, Angola, and Madagascar. Now, later onwards, especially in the late 1700s, early 1800s, it leveled out through contact with Arabic, English, and was restructured through the standardization of Afrikaans. Now, this process of mixture, leveling out, and restructuring of early Kaaps in South Africa, we have come to know are driven by many stories that describe how some of the Khoi were forced into slavery and forced to learn Dutch and Portuguese, or learned Dutch through short, less intimate degrees of contact, such as the inland cattle grazing Khoi, who came to learn Dutch by means of signs and many broken Dutch and English words picked up by accident. We also find, and we have found in our archival research, stories of linguistic outliers, interpreters frequently used by colonialists, or referred to by Jan van Riebeeck himself. At the Cape, famously, it is well known that the Khoi speakers were used as interpreters. Atsumoa, the leader of the Grong Haikona, Duman, and the small Khoi girl Krotoa, named by Jan van Riebeeck as Ava, were used as interpreters between the Khoi living inland and the colonialists. Krotoa, for example, learned to speak Dutch from van Riebeeck, his family, and Portuguese from the slaves at the castle, kept at the castle. In van Riebeeck's diaries, for example, he refers to the competence of Krotoa's Dutch as perfect. She is fluent, and in the period of her staying with van Riebeeck, she became a competent speaker of Dutch and Portuguese. Here, for example, he records in his diary complaining, or how she is complaining about Duman, the other adult translator, and van Riebeeck writes this down in his diary. It's interesting to note here that in his diary, van Riebeeck represents, or seems to represent, the voice of Krotoa. And he's very much aware of her use of Dutch, but also the influence of Malay or on her Dutch. The word subat is not a Dutch word, it's a Malay word. And we could speculate that she picked up this word from Duman because he spent some time in Batavia, going there once and coming back. But here she's complaining about Duman, and he's writing it down in Dutch. Now, in considering the contributions of early contact with the Khoi and the many slaves brought to the Cape and the Dutch, historical linguistic studies on the creolization of Kaaps have opened up discussion about which languages became donor languages versus which language became the recipient language that converged to make Kaaps. Now, this led us to ask several questions. What are the primary sources from slaves, Khoi, and the indigenous indentured workers? What does it tell us about the linguistic ecology that caused contact-inducing changes in the lexicon and grammar of early Kaaps, for example? And how did the process of Khoinization follow? That is the process of mixing, leveling, simplification, and reallocation that led to the creolization of Kaaps. And what can we trace carefully in the archive about the restructuring or the systematic reorganization of Kaaps over time? Now, historical linguistics experts argues that you cannot extract Kaaps from any investigation of Afrikaans, and you have to look at Kaaps and the information of Afrikaans and trace it back to the Khoi and the Dutch, or you have to look at the influences of Malay on the formation of Kaaps. What was striking, and what is still striking for us, that many of these authors rely on secondary sources, not to a large extent, but they do not provide specific insight into the primary sources, or into primary sources, texts, letters, that we can study from the 18th and 19th century. We had to remedy this. We had to go into the archive and look for the voices of these speakers, of these slaves. It had to be there, and it cannot not be there. And what we did over the last year and a half was to dig into the archives at the Western Cape Archives and Records in Roland Street, and there are about over 1,000 files of slaves who has written in their own hand about their experiences at the Cape. I remember reading one of the slave letters, and it began with "Mijn goede vriend," without the T at the end, and no, it's an error. I said, no, it's fake. And then I read another letter, and it said, "Mijn goede vriend." It's like, whoa, something is happening here. So at the moment, what we are doing are digging through these files, studying letters received at the Cape from the 1600s up to the early 1800s. We are looking at notebooks by slaves, court cases, criminal witness testimonies by slaves and indentured workers. Of course, there's a question mark because whoever wrote down that witness testimonies were either the administrator in the court. But we are also looking at trials of slaves and what slaves left behind that is in the liquidation and distribution accounts. Letters that I've left behind, wills that I have left behind, testimonies. One, or let's say two examples stick out for us. In the liquidation and distribution accounts of free black slaves, and these were typically the Mardekas, in Sanskrit it's Merdeka, I'm probably mispronouncing that, but it meant free, or made reference to free. Two interesting individuals stick out for us in the archive. This is Nicholas Ondaatje and Arnoldus Kufut. Nicholas was banished to the Cape because for minor offenses. He came from Colombo, and in his folder in the archive there are about 66 Sinhalese letters. But of the 6 letters in his folder, there are clear early lexical uses and phrases that we still find in present day, or being used in present day South Africa amongst Kaaps speakers. This is a copy of his memory book where he noted things down such as I owe Andries $60 and you know he also taught at the slave lodge. He used to write down the names of the children he taught. But in the history of historical linguistics or Afrikaans studies, he has been appropriated as, and it has been suggested that he was teaching Afrikaans children at the slave lodge for some reason. These kids were slaves, but it's a story we can get into at the Q&A. Arnoldus Kufut, he was also a free black slave, and he wrote a lot of letters back to Batavia. And these letters were correspondence between his sister and his brother Andries, and it was about debts. It's about how much he owes them, asking for food and clothes, etc., etc. So we've approached the archive in the way that it is supposed to be approached, to excavate the voices of Kaaps, early Kaaps speakers, the slaves, and to provide evidence of early Kaaps use. And for us, that has led to an understanding that when you study Kaaps in this early 1600s and the 1700s, it had to be there in the 1800s as well. A very interesting turn comes about because of the increasing importation of slaves, the increasing presence of the Muslims at the Cape. Suddenly, the language becomes associated with the Muslims of the Cape, the Arabic speakers of the Cape, the speakers from Java who speak Old Javanese or Javanese. During the 1800s, for example, regularly there were travelers to the Cape, and one important individual in this story of Kaaps came to transform not only Kaaps but also Afrikaans. This was the Islamic scholar Abu Bakr Effendi. He's a very interesting individual because his contributions to the development of Kaaps are important, since he invented new letters in Arabic as a result of his learning of Cape Dutch at the Cape, or Kaaps. He also provides a window onto the linguistic restructuring of Kaaps and is a primary source from which we can draw on to make diachronic comparisons of Kaaps with other languages. Now, how did he get to the Cape? There were trouble at the Cape amongst the Muslims themselves. They were complaining about not knowing their language, not knowing Javanese, not having the correct material to interpret their lives the way it's supposed to be interpreted as expressed in the Quran. And so there was a complaint sent to Queen Victoria, who then in turn begged the Sultan of Turkey, Abd al-Aziz, to send a well-trained scholar to Africa to quell disputes about some points of religion among her Muslim subjects. This letter was sent by the Muslims to the ambassador to the Ottoman Empire of the Cape, E.F.H. de Roubaix. And in this letter, the Cape Muslims bemoaned the lack of literature and original language use, Javanese. Cape Muslims acknowledged the need to request help from the Osmanli Caliphate, rulers then in charge, and as such, petitioned for religious books, an Islamic scholar, and generally better assistance for the Muslims at the Cape. And it is a very interesting individual. I sort of define him as this accidental missionary linguist who comes to the Cape. But like Jan van Riebeeck, he is miserable. He hates it there. But in the end, he stays. That's where he's buried, on Signal Hill, in Cape, Table Mountain. But his arrival and settling in at the Cape moved him to learn Cape Dutch, early Kaaps. And as he put it in his diary, the majority of the Muslim inhabitants of Cape Town, Dalgoa Bay, and the neighboring towns were not conversant with the Arabic language, exceptions being a very few who were Arab immigrants and those who were of Arab descent. I realized that in order to make myself understood, I would have to master the language, Cape Dutch, Afrikaans. Okay, this is the interpretation of the author here. Spoken by the majority, and I therefore set myself the great task of learning Cape Dutch to enable me to explain to them the Quran and the meaning of the Arabic idioms necessary to carry out the basic rules of the religion, to translate the text and teach these people in their own language the true Islamic religion. Now I say this is the interpretation, this Dutch, i.e. Afrikaans, of the author, because when you study his books, there are a lot of early Kaaps in it, and I'll demonstrate now. Now, in order to help the Muslims at the Cape, he needed to unify the Imams and also provide a text for them to interpret the Quran. And so he published his instructions on Islamic rituals, the Bayan al-Din, and he wrote it up and invented features of Arabic, inflecting what we know as some of the earliest forms of phonetic Afrikaans, but also Kaaps. At the time, of course, there was only one type of press that could print Roman script, not Arabic numerals, so he had to send it back to Turkey to be printed. But it's very interesting because he wrote 3 introductions to the Bayan al-Din, one in Turkish for the Sultan, one in Arabic for the Mozambicans and Mauritanians. He was very worried about them, and the other one in Cape Dutch. It's written in a very accessible style. And I say that this sort of interpretation might not be accurate because many of the words and phrases that you find in the Bayan al-Din, and I deliberately did not translate this because I want you to hear how it sounds when I say it out loud. Many of these words are Kaaps words. Op te maak, nie om oop te maak. This is very early use of Kaaps, still used today. Some of the phrases, for example, altwi alleen. Here it's altwi alleen. we in Kaaps, we dropped the E in that first phrase. And then for many of these words with that have these final rhotic R, present-day Kaaps speakers don't pronounce it. So at the time when he writes this, in a way he sort of affects a restructuring of Kaaps, but he tries to capture the use of Kaaps of the day. And we found it especially fascinating because I showed this to some of the students that I work with, and they were confused because they thought this was a Kaaps speaker writing today, because they recognized some of these forms and phrases. In many ways, Abu Bakr Effendi was a pioneer, and we are trying to find out how Kaaps really was used and sort of developed further in the 1800s, even up to the Union of South Africa, because at the time of the Union of South Africa, what we understand and what texts teach us about Kaaps is that it becomes this language that becomes associated with the street. It's known to be used in the street, in the everyday. It's informal. You can hear it in gossip, in stories. But then later it becomes, with the emergence of apartheid, a protest language, a language that you can pray in. The text straatpraatjes or straatpraatjies, street language, have these columns that are not only in Dutch, but definitely it uses Kaaps. It's all over the pages. And this text was compiled by Muhammad Adhikari, and the columns were published from 1909 to 1922. In 1940, S.V. Peter, Sidney Vernon Peterson, used Kaaps to bring alive characters in his books. Characters that were published in his columns, published in The Weekend, and also his novel As the Sun Sets. As the Sun Sets beautifully captures how the main character interacts with characters on a train going to Cape Town. But it's in apartheid where Kaaps is associated with being a resistant language. And Adam Small here and Peter Snyders are some of the writers who capture a language that you can pray in. Not only can you pray in it, but you can also protest against protest in it against the ills of a separatist racist government. So for much of the 1960s to 1980s, these mainstream writers have captured the lived experience of Kaaps speakers on the Cape Flats. While these mainstream authors were under the spotlight, and while the country was burning, even at the height of the most violent period of apartheid, this is the 1980s, activists used Kaaps to express their frustration with the apartheid government. First, they celebrated Kaaps, the culture of Kaaps, from the late 1970s. But then in the early 1980s, as the apartheid government ramped up kidnappings, killings, imprisonments, there was an outpouring of grief amongst non-mainstream poets who write in Kaaps. Here you have an example of an untitled poem written by Samila Francis detailing how in protest a white police officer was robbed. This is from the archive of the Congress of South African Writers, who met in a secret location to use Kaaps and other languages to express their frustration and to protest against the apartheid government. Here, what is retained are the characteristics of Kaaps in terms of its lexical, phonological constructions, certain very unique lexical items, the use of agglutinated forms, kikitsi, for example, and a lot of accented English being used, like 20 bugs in this particular poem. Now, I present these examples from the history, and it's a snapshot of Kaaps and how it develops from the early 1600s to the late 1980s, to state that throughout these ages, or throughout the decades, Kaaps has retained its diversity. And we are still trying to understand the history of Kaaps and how it developed. And we're trying to build the archive to demonstrate that indeed, if you pay attention to it in very specific ways, you get a better understanding of what Kaaps is in its linguistic form. But in post-apartheid South Africa, as linguists, you have to provide, the necessary linguistic infrastructures so that you can truly empower the speakers. And so what we've decided as a third act of liberation is to develop a dictionary and to also develop school curriculum material. Because we are faced with the fact that we need to raise the functions of Kaaps so that it is used in controlling domains or institutions. The speakers remain disempowered and experience linguistic injury on a daily basis. In order for us to secure the future of Kaaps, we have begun to develop these important linguistic infrastructures or resources to advance the empowerment of Kaaps. And so when a few years ago we launched the Trilingual Dictionary Project, and just after that we decided to develop bilingual learning materials. Now, this dictionary project raises important questions around the endpoint of empowerment of the Kaaps speaker. We know Kaaps is not an official language. We also know that the orthography requires a coherent, and we also know that the way it is used in schools is through translanguaging practices, and you don't find it used in controlling domains. But we also understand that people have asked us about what are you doing or considering when we talk about the standardization of Kaaps. When we launched the project, it reached the president's desk, and for us it's standardization without standardization, because we are trying to retain the diversity of Kaaps. And the president in 2021 made this announcement that he congratulates the team on this major milestone of publishing the first dictionary of Afrikaans, also known as Kaaps. I was horrified at this because we are not finished with the dictionary. It will be published, we hope this year, but it's not finished. But he had a good mind of reflecting on the history of Kaaps, where it comes from, how it was influenced, and so forth and so on. The dictionary it has been an interesting exercise, because we decided from the start that the language will be in Kaaps. The examples will be in Kaaps, but it will be translated to Afrikaans and Standard English. Here are two examples that gives you an idea of how the dictionary will be laid out. This is the lemma hana hana, that's, you're wasting time. It's unidirectional, so in other words, you read it only in one direction and not back. Here's also an example of, so the first one is a verb, the second one is an example of an agglutinated form, inkrimpwoord or werkwoord. And when it comes to these forms, agglutinated forms, we decided not to translate these functional words because it would be unnecessary. Many of the examples they come not only from written text, but also from rap songs, from conversations. And in this example is from one of my favorite MCs, MC Cole, who has donated his music to be transcribed and represented in the dictionary. Now, many of the questions that was raised when we announced the dictionary project concerned this question: are we standardizing Kaaps? Are we working towards the standardization of Kaaps? Now, of course, we are aware that dictionaries function as a colonial tool of governmentality, in the sense that if you know the words, you control the people. Yet our challenge has been to develop a dictionary that is different. The language of description is in Kaaps and not standard Afrikaans and English. All the compilers are Kaaps speakers who live and are from the Cape Flats. The Cape Flats is the township area. I'm going to get myself into trouble here, Andres. But it's the sort of flatland area 20 miles outside the central business district. So if you think favelas, you get somewhat of a picture of the township. The dictionary, when it will be published and when you hold it in your hand, will be a sort of a trans-language type dictionary resource for students in primary and secondary schools. But that should be accompanied by bilingual learning curriculum material. And if we do so, we retain not only the variation in Kaaps, but we acknowledge the speaker's agency and voice. Agency here meaning your ability to bring about institutional change. Voice, your ability to make yourself heard. And Kaaps students in particular will have formal accessibility to school without the exclusionary impact of standardization. But okay, there are no bilingual curriculum material in Kaaps. The school system has gradually taken Kaaps literature off the curriculum. What do we do? Now, we've recognized this as a challenge, just as much as codifying Kaaps and developing later the grammar and orthography of Kaaps. And so we sprung into action, and my colleague here, Robin Tyler, has this wonderful project at the Center for Multilingualism and Diversities Research that I direct. And we've decided that not only do we need to develop bilingual curriculum material for isiXhosa, but also for Kaaps. So there are two research groups. The one focuses on isiXhosa, and the other group, this is me, focuses on Kaaps. And it's been interesting so far. We've had several focus groups with teachers, senior subject advisors from the education departments and academics. And we've learned from the teachers that the current curriculum is anti-Kaaps. The teachers point out there are several limitations with the handbooks, for example, when you teach, for example, grade 6 natural science and technology, and where it concerns the use of mathematics, the Kaaps learners find themselves in a bind. There's a language barrier, and so learning mathematics in English or standard Afrikaans becomes a burden. The teachers also has sort of implored with us to innovate, draw on culturally relevant and culturally sustaining examples, draw on the backgrounds of the Kaaps learners and the way they use Kaaps on an everyday basis. But they also questioned us about how they should write these materials in Kaaps, since there is a lot of variation in Kaaps when it comes to writing. So this is a problem, a challenge for us. Over the last year and since our initial focus group, we have tried to translate a full term of material to develop curriculum material for a subject called natural science and technology, or science, our language, or taal, and mathematics, or stel op. And these are the logos that we've developed. We need to mock up the curriculum material and then test it out in the field with the parents, the learners, and the teachers who will implement it. Okay. But it's not enough, because our biggest problem, besides developing the dictionary, besides developing the bilingual learning curriculum material, our biggest challenge is sustaining the research, the science around Kaaps. And we need to build a community in order to advance Kaaps. The archival project needs to be sustained. And we sort of looked at how this can be sustained, how projects such as these can be sustained, especially when such projects does it beautifully in organizing information that that develops bilingual glossaries or focuses on bilingual glossaries in the content. So our fourth act of liberation is to establish a linguistic society, or a society for the advancement of Kaaps, to bring a group of scientists, activists, teachers, policymakers together, historians together, so that we can sustain what we are doing. And so we have put plans in place. We have a Kaaps symposium coming up this year in August, and we have launched the Society for the Advancement of Kaaps. The aim of the society will be to develop and maintain scientific research and development programs that advances Kaaps in South Africa and beyond, such as an archival program of oral and written documentary records for research purposes. But the society will also establish various linguistic, or establish and support various linguistics endeavors, educational endeavors, literacy, literature, language policy, and so on. This is important for us, and so far over 40 members have signed up, and we have yet to meet as a society. Okay, let me conclude. So, and then before I close, and I hope I am in time still. First a story, and then I'll go on to these challenges. I remember meeting the chair of the Pan-South African Language Board. This is the board that the Constitution's mandates to, look after official languages and historically marginalized languages in South Africa. And in, where I live, it's quite a long drive to Stellenbosch, but we met in Stellenbosch. And I remember the chair told me in my face, under no circumstances can we be seen publicly to support Kaaps. We cannot support you. You need to first develop your dictionary, a corpus, lists, term lists. So in other words, you need to meet the requirements that government has set out for you. It was a very long drive back from Stellenbosch for me. I mean, I was disheartened because this is the chair of the Pan-South African Language Board. But I think when I got home, I was like, so what? We're just going to continue, and and we'll come back to the table to argue our case. The story here is a story that has been erased over time, hasn't been properly acknowledged. And what we are trying to do with the dictionary project here is to put out a product, something that's real for the speakers, so that it challenges everyday stereotypes of Kaaps speakers. That Kaaps is not seen as just gangster language, that it is worthy of codification, but that we've worked very hard to codify Kaaps. that, to challenge suggestions and conclusions that Kaaps is too informal, cannot be codified. But more importantly, to push against linguistic fixities, hegemonies, and this hierarchical idea of language that is still circulating in South Africa and being sustained by linguistic work in the South African context. At the same time, the archival project challenges folklore and myths about Kaaps and its speakers. And the bilingual curriculum materials project asserts the agency of the speakers and the participation and reconceptualization of Kaaps speakers against those culturally irrelevant representations that have been inherited from colonialism and apartheid. Before I came here, I printed out the dictionary. It's almost done, and we are very proud of it. It has over 7,000 head words, lemmas, and we are very surprised at that as well. And we hope to continue the work that I have spoken here about. Thank you.
Thank you, Quentin. So time for questions. Since there's people on Zoom, we'll do the questions by a microphone so that people on Zoom can also hear the questions.
Yeah, Jeff.
Well, thank you very much for that. It's fascinating. As you know, my area is West Africa, and
Right.
I'm interested in the relationship between orality and literacy. And I've become increasingly pessimistic about literacy programs and dictionaries and written works,
Right.
because they just don't. The people aren't very. They're symbolically very important for prestige, for self-image, and so forth. But what really works in terms of vitality is orality. So
Right.
people are using WhatsApp instead of written email, and they're they're dropping out of school,
Right.
frankly. And but orality, the oral medium, the videos and the other forms of orality really taking on. I wonder what role that plays in your programs.
I'd like you to play a bigger role, and I want to say that, saying that a lot of what we do is in concert with what hip-hop language activists. I mean, I've learned a lot from them, and very little from the sociolinguists, I must say. Just because they are underground, they meet the speakers every day, and then there's Emil YX question mark, just like that. That's how you express it. He created Hilderhood project, and he goes to schools and tells stories in Kaaps, where usually it is told in standard English or standard Afrikaans. And the moment he connects with the sort of the kids in the classroom, their faces light up, because here my language is being used to tell a story that is so boring in the textbook. So that is very important. We haven't included, stories being told orally in the dictionary, but there are scripts, movie scripts, and other forms of audio that we have transcribed and sort of extracted the head words from that we wanted to describe. But it needs to be there more. And I understand the point also about how important or less important the dictionary will be. And I've been reminded from the get-go that but not just the dictionary. But I think if you know anything about the very polarizing language politics in South Africa, that when it comes to historically marginalized languages, if you are able to demonstrate that something like a dictionary opens up the idea that this language is now becoming empowered, albeit through a dictionary, it is one of many steps towards liberation and empowerment. So we have to look at it as such. I made an example that when I was at the Adam Small, it's a lecture endowed in Adam Small's name, there was a particular generation of Kaaps speakers in the room. And when I showed the examples I showed you about the dictionary, people were in tears, because finally, what apartheid has done to us, we are still alive and we can see that there are a movement, development when it comes to Kaaps. Because we wanted to have that, and now finally it's materializing.
In case you have any questions, you can just walk to the microphone and put it here.
We do have a question from the Zoom audience, so thank you for this. Yon Clayton Jones asks or says, thank you for a very interesting presentation. How many Kaaps speakers do you estimate there currently are? How many of these are school-going age? So.
Yeah, this is the same question that Hanston Beston's childhood friend asked me. And Hanston Beston is the big, as you know, historical linguist who supported Kaaps a lot, and we don't know. We haven't made a census, but it's a huge population. Yeah, that's probably the best answer I can give you.
Hi, thank you
Hi,
so much
Judith.
for this, Quentin. It's really, it's so fascinating and inspiring. I'm interested in the ways that effective difference or boundaries between languages get established.
Right.
And I have always supposed that, and I guess there's some literature on how Afrikaans got to be conceived of as something distinct from Dutch,
Right.
which would not have been a project without its tendentious character, I'm sure. But so I'm wondering about that here. In some other cases, in other parts of the world, such projects have involved picking forms from varieties that were the most distant from the variety that you wanted not to be. So
Right.
the most distant from Afrikaans, but not turning into Dutch either, or English.
Right.
So I wonder about if you could speak to those kinds of projects as they affect the dictionary making and your choice of forms to put in it.
Yeah. I think the focus has been on Kaaps so much that we sort of looked at it this way. There's Kaaps, and Kaaps has its own varieties. It's varieties used in the rural area, distinct from the varieties spoken on the Cape Flats. That's how we approached it, because we didn't want to be tied down by this very sort of sometimes big debate around Afrikaans. We know the history very well and what happened, because every soldier that came from Batavia who knew Low Portuguese and High Portuguese, not necessarily Malay Portuguese as Hesseling would have characterized it, came to the Cape and understood to a fair degree the slave lingua franca being spoken amongst the slaves. I think it's with the identity of the Afrikaner, or the Freeburger, and it's sort of the move towards nationalism, the vlok and the volk, or een vlok and een volk, that there's a sort of a distinction being developed within that particular idea of what Afrikaans became, how it was labeled, and how it defined in the end Afrikaners. I mean, we don't need to get into a debate around that. It's being done, as being talked about almost on a daily basis. For us, it concerned Kaaps. Even with for example, the standardization debate, many of those questions were not asked by Kaaps speakers, but by white Afrikaans activists and linguists saying, are you going to replace our standard Afrikaans? No, it's called the Trilingual Dictionary of Kaaps. We are adding to it. So in many ways, we wanted to understand Kaaps, its varieties, how it's spread across geographical regions, and how we could indicate that this is from the Boerland, for example, this particular form used by Ashwin Arendse in his writing, as opposed to Nathan Trantral in his writing. The author who grew up in Bishoplevis, where I came from as well. That is our concern, and how it influenced this sort of the various forms influenced, the growth and structuring of Kaaps within post-apartheid South Africa. And we're still figuring it out, so it's a process of growth.
I'm going to alternate between Zoom and in-room questions, if that's okay. So we do have another question on Zoom. Wanga Gambushe says, enjoyed listening to that presentation. Makoni and Pennycook, 2006, speak about how missionaries created, in quotes, created many African languages through standardization. So I think this is really topical. Wanga asks, what is the final aim for Kaaps? Elevation to high function spaces such as education through standardization, or a fluid translingual approach? So I think that's just what you were getting at.
Wanga is a former student of mine and a colleague today, and I don't know why he asked me that. Wanga, what's wrong with you? I don't know. My goal is just to sort of take it one project at a time. I'm driven by the speakers. I mean, really on the streets, the Kaaps speakers knows what is happening, because we've been in the public's eye. We've been doing the type of public activism so that people are aware of the projects. There are these frustrations, these pitfalls I reflected on. But if we sort of think about them all the time, it distracts us from the goal. That really we want the Kaaps speakers to be empowered. And to the same degree that, the isiXhosa speaker still needs to be empowered. The isiZulu speaker still needs to be empowered, even though those languages are official languages within the South African context. It's weird, right? That they still remain, to a certain degree, disempowered, even though they are official languages. So I don't know, but we should speak Wanga when I come back.
Thank you very much for this great presentation. I have two questions.
Sure.
The first one is, can you share with us how you've involved the native speakers of Kaaps in this project? And my second question is, in what way has the community of Kaaps responded to this project so far? Right.
I'll start with the last one. In venues that we have spoken about the project, two things happen. A lot of tears, first because it's the first time it's happening, and then, why are you going to standardize my language? Are you going to tell me how to speak? You can't tell me how to speak. I refuse. So that's the two groups. And really, to the second group, we always explain, look, we are retaining the diversity of Kaaps. Look at all the variations. It's still there. So please don't scream at me. But I do welcome the critique, because otherwise, how will we grow as linguists? We're not superstars, even though we dream of it sometimes. And many of the Kaaps speakers on the project, they are drawn from the community. They are students, not my students alone in the linguistics department, but from the Afrikaans department as well. They know Dutch as well, very well. But we have, through the methodology of dictionary making, we have asked Kaaps speakers to send words over Instagram, over Twitter, texts, and we've gone out to the communities to teach them how to compile word lists so that they are aware of the dictionary project. So we've been actively involved in sort of bringing the community into the project, because the activists that we are working with, and I sort of pointed out that it's not only linguists on the project, there are activists on the project as well. They do draw in the community, and we will do so more and more. Ideally, we want to release the dictionary first on the Cape Flats. And it's only right. Yeah. And schedules allowing, so we hope we do it more and more. Yeah.
So Aya had a question, and then I think we might go back online.
Okay, so yeah, we mentioned the word South Africa a lot of times in this session. Like, first of all, I owe big thanks to South Africa. South Africa made history last Friday in the International Court of Justice, and I just want to highlight this out for everyone. The second thing is, like you mentioned, the revitalization and documentation of a certain language post-apartheid, post-colonization. I wonder what your recommendations concerning the communities that still persist under occupation, colonization, where using a certain language is weaponized to the extent that this language is a second language or a third language. Like, people in their communities, in their land, are not allowed to use their language. I'm speaking of Arabs, Arab Palestinians who live in Israel. What can we do to help these communities?
I think we have to realize that, as linguists, the work we do is descriptive. It's not prescriptive. But we have to use the tools that we have been taught to document languages and teach the community. We have to go out there and relinquish our power of those tools. I love the examples, for example, for some of the African American social linguists working here with African American communities, teaching them how to do hip-hopography work, for example, ethnographic field work, so that they can learn or know that it's not rocket science. Linguistics is not rocket science, and the very strict definition of it. That's what you have to do. That's what we have done in our group. In order for the community to understand that we are not working in silos, in cubicles, or on a hill, that you too can know what it means to write down this particular vowel in this particular way. That even though you're not an expert in IPA, you can still get an understanding of how to develop your language. There's a documentary on YouTube. It's called Kaaps, which is also reference to Kaaps. And in the documentary, you get a sense of what we do on a daily basis, how we go into the field and teach the kids about their language, conscientize them about their language. That's what we have. I mean, we are limited as linguists, in what we can do. But our limitation is only there if we realize we can go beyond that. And there are many examples in this room of linguists, linguistic anthropologists who have done the work to contribute to communities and empower them with the tools that they have. Yeah.
So let's go back online, and then we can come here.
Okay, so the next question also comes from Eon Clayton Jones, who asks, in your opinion, is the difference between Afrikaans and Kaaps bigger or smaller than the difference between Afrikaans and Flemish?
I don't want to get into the whole Bart de Wever, I'd like to leave them alone in Belgium, So can I just say that in terms of the Belgian part, because that's going to open up another kettle of, which I don't want to sort of deal with. But I think the first one, I don't have a definitive answer on that, because if the historical linguistic studies to a large degree are based on secondary resources, and we've begun to question it, and they are put forward as authoritative voices. You know, it's like, no, it has to be that way. We're like, well, hang on, but what is this doing in the archive here, this early in the colonial period of South Africa? And we are questioning this idea of the custodianship of Afrikaners over, Kaaps. Because at which point did you decide to call Kaaps a variety of Afrikaans? Was it at the Union, 1910, 1940? Was it during the patriotic days? And how did you use the SA Academy for Wetenskap en Kuns? This is the Afrikaans version of the SA Academy of Science, Arts and Sciences. How did you use that to legitimate? How did you use that science to prop up this ideology of legitimacy, saying that we're in this hierarchy on top and you are at the bottom? Even in the documentary Kaaps, the kids say, it's like we're speaking of bastardized type of Afrikaans. Pure Afrikaans is on top and we are at the bottom. It has to stop.
So we do have time for a few more questions, but at some point we should give our speaker a break. We have time for a few more.
Thank you so much for your talk. I really learned a lot. My own work thinks about the other side of the continent, or the further up from you, so East Africa, and the language I'm thinking about a lot as you've been talking about Kaaps is Sheng in Kenya. And by thinking about that, I'm curious about the rate of change of Kaaps, right? So in Kenya, if they were to attempt, and there have been attempts to create a Sheng dictionary, but if they were to do that, or if they do that, it becomes a historical document after 3 months, because that's how fast Sheng changes. And so I'm curious, when you say that the Kaaps speakers of a certain age, when you present this to them, they're in tears, is the version that they are speaking similar or different from the ones that I guess younger people, younger Kaaps speakers are speaking? And in addition to that, you mentioned that there are different varieties of Kaaps within South Africa. So Kaaps that is spoken in different, outside of Cape Town is different. First of all, how different are they, and which version of Kaaps are you putting in the dictionary?
Yeah. So, this is it's sort of the trap of selecting, matrix variety and saying this is the one that we want to include. That's not what we are doing. We are retaining the diversity, and we putting a marker to say this word comes from a particular region, so that the speakers know that, oh, there is a difference between these particular words that we use on a daily basis. And there is a difference between the Kaaps speakers from the 1980s, 1970s, and the Kaaps speakers today. I mean, I keep on telling hip-hop artists, do not create a new word, we just describe the word. And then, there's this artist, youngster CPT, and he created a new greeting word by using the old word. He put a question mark in it, and it's problematic because now the kids are saying, you need to include it in the dictionary. And these are the compilers working on a dictionary, and I have to tell them to stop, But, you can't really stop it, it's a very sort of organic way of the language growing. So, I mean, in a way, I don't have a clear answer about this because we're still learning on how to sort of really pin this language down and what we can do to finalize a dictionary. Maybe when it moves from its structural state to its organic state, we can begin to add new words to the dictionary. But it doesn't have the same challenges that Sheng has, because the Bible has been translated. There are plays, novels being written in Kaaps. Every year there are several books being published. So there is this is sort of a slowing down of Kaaps to the point where we can understand, okay, this is its structure, and now we can sort of really study how it is structured and are beginning to restructure. Yeah.
So maybe let's give time for the final question. That's a lot of pressure on the next question asker. Acrisio.
So I knew nothing about Kaaps. This was a fantastic talk. It's so great to hear you talk about
Thank
all
you.
the work that you were doing regarding the language and the recognition of it. And I looked up the Wikipedia entry for Kaaps,
Oh no.
which turns out to be awful. And basically has 2 paragraphs about stigmatization and about the identity and social status.
Do they mention my name?
They mentioned the dictionary,
Yeah,
the dictionary project. So there is some kind of reference to a lot of references to stigma about the language and
Yeah.
the bad portrayals of the language. And then you're talking about all the things that are published in the language already. So what is the answer to that? And what is the general response that you have to that kind of portrayal of the language?
They need to first take off the Wikipedia page and come speak to me so that we can repopulate it, because it's inaccurate, a lot of the things there. I was quite horrified to sort of read the page, but I think it's because the folks at Wikipedia wants to have Wikipedia pages in Kaaps. And so they're now pushing us to create this community to sort of, write for Wikipedia. Many of the speakers have internalized the negative stereotypes associated with Kaaps. I was speaking at a community gathering, and the lady at the back stood up and said, whenever I open up my mouth, I feel inferior. Everybody is controlling the way I speak. I don't know what to do. I feel tongue-tied. I don't want to speak in Kaaps, so I switched to English. Many of the young men, when they speak Kaaps, they are framed as gangsters. They speak in a particular way. They are profiled linguistically because of that. And many of the teachers we have found who teach Afrikaans as a subject, 98% of them have a negative attitude towards the inclusion of Kaaps in the curriculum or teaching in Kaaps. I mean, these are very real things out in the world, and we can only come together as a community and begin to transform these internalized attitudes and negative stereotypes through learning about what would happen if you raise the functions of Kaaps. What would happen if you change the fate of this language for people who, the majority are working class. You can't eat a language, you can't. But these things might enable folks to eat. So it's very real for us. It affects people's lives, their livelihoods. So it's extremely hard work, and you can't do this alone. You have to have a community that sort of drives campaigns and go out there to promote Kaaps literacy, Kaaps education, and indeed what it would mean to hear the news being read on the radio, on television in Kaaps. That's the best answer I can give you.
Thank you for such impactful work and against bias and discrimination.
Thank you.
And thank you, Quentin. Really, it was wonderful having you here. Thank you. And let me also again apologize to you and everybody else that I missed at the beginning those two slides. I knew why they were there. I talked to the Colloquium committee earlier today to ask, are those slides there? And they confirmed that they were. And it slipped my mind when I stood here. It shouldn't have. I apologize for that. Also for you that I interrupted you in the middle.
That's fine. Thank you.
So thank you everybody for coming. I believe there's a reception around the corner here, right? So please stay around and talk that way.
Yeah.
Talk with Quentin and talk with each other. Thank you very much.
Thank you.